Outside the window, the rain was pouring. The man passionately sat Yuseniel down on the table, hugging her around the waist. The brunette was breathing heavily, watching every move of the prince. Nazbel whispered his beloved's name, hugging her even tighter. The girl, embarrassed, covered her face with her hand, quietly asking him to wait a little. Suddenly, the man pulled the string on Yuseniel's shirt with his teeth. Smiling, he admitted that he was genuinely glad they had met, and that she had found him. Gathering her courage, the girl said the prince's name seriously, pushing him away. He, without taking his eyes off the brunette, asked what was the matter. Yuseniel asked if he had really given the order to execute the marquise's eldest son. Her voice was serious and coldly distrustful. A thunderstorm rumbled. Tesfalun Nazbel nodded, explaining that it was a well-deserved punishment. Then he gently kissed the girl's hand. The prince raised his head and noticed Yuseniel's surprised eyes. He asked cautiously if the marquise's eldest son had proposed to her. The guy smirked and said that he had no right to lay claim to what belonged to him. Arrogance flashed in his eyes. Nazbel said that he doted on the girl. She only looked down in embarrassment, raising her thin eyebrows pitifully. He took her hand in his, running his finger gently over her skin, and looking into her eyes, he licked her finger. With tenderness in his voice, he said how much he loved her. He pushed Yuseniel down onto the table, leaning down on her. His gestures were demanding, as if he wanted her to look only at him. The girl couldn't understand how everything had come to this point. It was as if her brain refused to perceive what was happening. His gaze was full of urgency and passion, and his hands were tightly clasped in an embrace. Yuseniel began to remember the moment when everything went downhill. Doctors rushed with a gurney to the intensive care unit. The victim had lost a lot of blood after the knife wound. Her condition was critical. The mother held her daughter's bloody hand tightly and frantically begged the doctors to save her. Streams of tears flowed from her eyes in fear for the child's life. Half-conscious, the girl apologized to her mother for leaving. In despair, she asked her not to close her eyes and not to leave this world. Yuseniel gasped in horror and jerked awake, gasping for breath. Her chest was tight, her breathing was ragged, and her pulse was beating furiously. Realizing that it was that dream again, the girl sighed tensely. She grabbed her heart, which was jumping out of her chest, trying to calm down. Danielle Harland immediately sensed her older sister's concern. She turned to her and asked with concern in her voice what was wrong. The girl asked anxiously if she was feeling unwell. Her sky-blue eyes showed a sincere desire to help. Noticing the strange behavior of their daughters, the parents worriedly suggested stopping the carriage. Yuseniel, looking out the window, quietly assured him that everything was fine. She added that it felt strange to return to the capital after 14 years. Mother Ciel asked with a smile if she was really worried. Father Mylene laughed and remarked that Ella was still his little girl. Suddenly, the carriage slowed down sharply and the wheels creaked shrilly. The servant bowed politely and announced that the family had arrived safely at the estate. Yuseniel walked out confidently, stepping into the square. In fact, she understood that her return to her father's house after so many years did not change anything. In the end, the heroine was Yuseniel Harland, from the Duke's family. She had come to this world from another world 20 years ago. The story seemed quite trivial to the girl. Having died as a result of a robbery in a past life, she soon woke up in another reality. The problem was that Yuseniel had no idea what to do next. She had never read a novel before and was not into games. At first, it all seemed like a dream, and her thoughts were confused like fog. Chaos reigned in her head, and she could not understand what was happening. The brunette's family came from a line of aristocrats who had once taken part in the founding of the empire. It was the Harland family. Contemplating, the girl looked at her younger sister, who admired their huge house. It seemed a little strange, but she was truly loved. Mother Ciel said that Gail was born after the exile, so this was her first time here. She noted that the estate was very different from their house in Valen. Looking down, Yuseniel apologized to everyone once again. She believed that they were sent there because of her. The whole family immediately rushed to console their daughter. Ciel told her not to blame herself for everything, and little Gail supported her mother's words with a smile. At first, this world seemed completely alien to the girl. However, after so much time, she still got used to it. Flattered, Yuseniel walked away from her loving parents and suggested they move on. They laughed and called her ignorant, but smiled and complied. Slowing down slightly, the aristocrat looked at her family with admiration. She did not understand how she could push away those who loved her so much. Suddenly, the girl's soul was filled with sadness. A light wind ruffled her hair as if the air itself sensed her inner anxiety. Yuseniel couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong here. She watched with longing as her family chatted animatedly, laughing. There was one thing Yuseniel had to do. She quickly walked up to her parents and addressed them with a spark of intrigue in her voice. Yuseniel smiled, took a deep breath, and then said that she would like to transfer to the Consume Research Center. The Consume Research Center was the nation's institute for the study of magic, housing the country's finest minds dedicated to uncovering its secrets. The institution had a long and fascinating history. It was also the organization that administered the Academy of Nobles. It is known that elves and gods existed in this world. Studying its features could become the key to returning to the heroine's homeworld. Yuseniel hadn't expected to be accepted into the institution so quickly. She passed the entrance exam, but it felt like they were waiting for her there. Arriving at the registration desk, the receptionist immediately jumped up, recognizing Lady Harland. Before she could say a word, he guessed the purpose of her visit. After some time, all the documents were ready. Holding the sheet in her hand, the aristocrat looked at it with pleasure. The girl chuckled contentedly and put her hand on her hip. She would soon be able to begin her research. The first day of school had arrived. Stepping onto the premises, Yuseniel cleared her throat and began to look at the students. Suddenly, the girl heard a contemptuous tone addressed to her. 3 bully girls stared at her, recognizing her identity. A student with bright red hair asked if the previous emperor had exiled the Harland family, and snorted as if she already knew the answer. There was a whisper from the crowd that told them to bite their tongues. Yuseniel heard that if His Majesty found out about this conversation, it would be hard for everyone. The girl assumed that the students were talking about the crown prince. Then she remembered hearing that this crybaby had ascended to the throne. Many years had passed since then. Yuseniel smiled, thinking about how quickly time had flown. Hearing the displeased tone, she was brought back to reality. The angry student had no intention of backing down. She clenched her fist angrily and called her rude for not deigning to answer. Yuseniel looked at the angry girl with arrogance. After a moment, she realized that the Marquise's daughter stood before her. Although the Harland family helped found the empire, they lost influence after their exile. Meanwhile, the Marquis family quickly gained power. The girl was not at all concerned about the struggle for power among the nobility, but she was not going to pity those who were hostile to her. Covering her mouth with her hand, the aristocrat involuntarily giggled. The bully froze in confusion, not understanding what was happening and how to react to it. After a few seconds, Yuseniel calmed down and asked with arrogance in her voice if the girl really was an aristocrat. She trembled slightly. The girl noted that treating someone you were meeting for the first time so familiarly was extremely disrespectful and completely unacceptable. She then asked if the girl's family was so poor that they couldn't teach her manners. The crowd jeered and the bully stood frozen in horror. Suddenly, she straightened her back and declared that she was Lily Cheyenne herself, not some low-born noblewoman. The crowd gasped as they saw him approaching. Lily confidently declared that the place of the next empress belonged only to her. People one by one began to bow to the approaching man. Chuckling, Yuseniel wished the girl luck. She added that she didn't care about such things, but this only made her interlocutor even more angry. Lily exploded into a scream, accusing her of pretending to be someone she knew not, who just because she had been friends with His Majesty for a long time. Suddenly, the aristocrat heard a deep chuckle behind her. She froze, praying that her guess was wrong. Yuseniel broke out in a cold sweat at the sight. She stepped back slightly, trying to swallow the lump that had suddenly risen in her throat. Lily Cheyenne covered her mouth with her hand in surprise when she noticed the man. For a moment, she even wanted to start biting her nails in panic. The brunette threateningly announced that he himself had given the order to restore the rights of the Harland family. Then he asked if the girl had dared to contradict his will. The crowd cheered enthusiastically for His Majesty, but he did not deign to look at them. With a wave of his hand, he ordered the bully to be taken away and executed. Stunned, Yuseniel could not utter a word. It seemed obvious to her that Tess was the only heir, and she did not even admit any other possibility. The man was tall and had a terrifying look that made her shiver. However, the girl could not figure out who he really was. There were countless worlds in the universe. They were located at great distances, so the existence of others was generally unknown. However, there was one question that no one knew the answer to. Sometimes, the inhabitants of these worlds could possibly move between them. The little girl sighed in disappointment and closed the book with force. Taking a deep breath, she tried to gather her strength and remain patient. Unable to contain herself, 6-year-old Yuseniel threw the writings into a pile of other books. Everything she had read turned out to be completely useless. The girl believed that instead of stating the obvious, authors should write about how exactly to travel between worlds. Hearing the rustling of grass and the clatter of footsteps, the aristocrat covered herself with a book, lowering her gaze. However, the boy easily noticed her sitting under a tree. Tess joyfully exclaimed his companion's name. Rolling her eyes, she only gasped with slight displeasure. The boy excitedly announced his arrival and confessed how much he missed the girl. He held one hand behind him, hiding a beautiful bouquet. Yuseniel looked at His Highness, greeted him and quickly looked away. The youth noted that they were alone and offered to call him by his name. Having gathered his courage, the boy enthusiastically handed the bouquet to the aristocrat. With joy in his eyes, he proposed that she marry him that day. Tess added that after this they could always be together, but she interrupted him. The girl sighed in disappointment, not wanting to upset her friend. Avoiding eye contact, Yuseniel repeated that he was not her type at all. The boy froze, unsure of what to say. Tess calmly asked what kind of young men she liked. The aristocrat looked up from her book in surprise and looked at her interlocutor. A light wind blew and she thought. At that moment it was really difficult for her to find the words to express her thoughts. However, now Yuseniel was faced with a tall, dark-haired man with a suffocating gaze. His granite gray eyes and sharp features inspired fear. Until this moment, the aristocrat believed that Tess was the only heir to the throne. What she saw proved that she was deeply mistaken. The first prince of the Northern Empire, Tesfalun Nosbel, was a crybaby with poor health. He had been Yuseniel's childhood friend and was always close to her. It seemed he had a good reason for ignoring the girl for 14 years. She was glad to learn that he had ascended to the throne. The prince looked at the aristocrat in silence, as if trying to look into the very depths of her soul. His gaze was piercing, tenacious, and anxious. Yuseniel was tormented by the thought of who this cold-blooded man was. Meanwhile, the employee grabbed Lily and she screamed, desperately trying to break free. Suddenly, an elderly man jumped out of the crowd. Addressing His Majesty, he rushed towards Cheyenne with impetuosity, not hiding his excitement. The director of the institution began to shout that Lily was just a young student who had made a mistake. He asked the prince to show mercy. The girl sobbed. The protector said that she was the daughter of the Marquis of Cheyenne. Coming closer, Nosbel reminded her that the previous emperor had taken everything from the Harland family. Years later, he returned their honor and the property they had taken away. Lily, trembling, tried to justify herself, but her voice betrayed her. The prince leaned over to the student and asked how the pathetic Marchioness of Cheyenne had dared to insult the noble Lady Harland. Goosebumps ran across her skin. Yuseniel watched the scene, clenching her fist tightly. A shadow of thought passed through her eyes. This guy was not like Tess at all. The girl could not believe that the prince's character had changed so much in 14 years. In addition, his eyes and hair were the color of a raven's wing. All members of the imperial family had a distinctive feature. Their eyes were blue and their hair was light, almost white. The aristocrat wondered why no one was surprised by his appearance. It seemed very strange to her. Yuseniel addressed His Majesty politely. Hearing the voice, he looked up and met the girl's eyes. Harland curtsied, bowing her head to the prince. She begged him to pardon Lady Cheyenne, hoping for his mercy. The aristocrat began to say that the bully had made a terrible mistake. She added that if the prince could forgive her, he would win everyone's respect. If this man was that crybaby Tess, her request would not go unheeded. She hoped that he had not forgotten about her after all these years. The girl straightened up, and before she could look up, she felt Nosbel's hand on her shoulder. He said that she had a very kind heart. The prince said that she had asked for mercy for the lady who had insulted her family. With a slight grin, he remarked that this was quite admirable. Yuseniel nodded hesitantly, still feeling afraid. That expression was indeed familiar to her. The aristocrat was sure that it was Tess in front of her. Suddenly, he turned around and, ordering not to execute her, ordered Lily Cheyenne to be locked up in the palace dungeon. Prince Nosbel announced that he was going for a stroll around the academy. He extended his hand to Lady Harland, asking her to accompany him. People began to whisper. The girl accepted the offer, extending her hand in return. Taking a deep breath, she tried to come to her senses and understand how he could have changed so much. Light clouds floated in the sky, and the bright sun broke through them, filling the world with soft light. The weather was warm and almost magically beautiful. The pair walked slowly through the trees. Yuseniel gave His Majesty a short tour, noting that the path was meant for walking. He remained silent again. The girl found it strange that they had already entered the forest, but Tess still had not said a word. The noblewoman pondered the prince's appearance. There was no sense of mana coming from him, and she doubted that he had changed his appearance with magic. There were no hair dyes or lenses in this world. Unable to understand how her childhood friend had changed so much, she decided that he had resorted to unknown magic. Suddenly, His Majesty began to mumble something, and it sounded like the girl's name. She froze, not knowing how to react. The man clearly pronounced the student's name. The next moment, he hugged her tightly from behind, pressing her to himself without a word. The girl froze warily, not understanding what was happening. He lowered his head, pressed himself against her neck, and she was still trying to comprehend his actions. Tesfalun Nosbel apologized. The noblewoman raised her eyebrows in surprise. Her eyes widened in disbelief. The man assumed that Yuseniel was angry that he had only just appeared, so she bowed to him and called him His Majesty. A warm smile appeared on the girl's face. Hearing a sob, she stroked his cheek, but he apologized again as if he could not calm down. The prince took her hand in his. She looked at him and called him by name tenderly. It was the same tear-stained face she had not seen for a long time. Tess sniffed in embarrassment, but the tears continued to flow. He was touched that she remembered his name, and it brought warmth to him. Yuseniel had always thought that if they returned to the capital, she would have to ask him about many things. There was too much that remained unclear. She did not understand why her family was exiled and why he never wrote. Tess, sobbing, held her hand tightly, as if it were his only support. Seeing this, she felt like a 6-year-old girl again. The aristocrat could not believe that he remained the same as in her memories. Unable to bear it any longer, the girl asked why the prince looked like that. She wondered why his eyes and hair had changed color. He kissed Lady Harlan's hand and said she liked it better that way. She said it didn't matter now, wondering how he had managed to do it. Nosbel explained that he now fully matched her taste. The aristocrat's face froze in bewilderment, and she suddenly remembered something. The man quoted his girlfriend as saying she was attracted to someone with black hair and dark eyes. A memory of that day came to mind. All this time, Tess kept the thought in his head that she was attracted to exactly these types of men. His eyes filled with tears again. Yuseniel started to say something, but he interrupted her, grabbing her tightly around the waist, not allowing her to continue. Nosbel informed her that he was now the emperor and no one would separate them again. He added that she would also not have to endure humiliation any longer. The man said that everything that belonged to him now belonged to her. In a fit of passion, he bit her ear and she gasped in surprise. Lady Harland was filled with a strange feeling. It seemed to her as if she had fallen into a perfectly prepared trap. The prince hugged Yuseniel even tighter. Then, smiling, he whispered in her ear that he loved her, and her heart began to beat faster with excitement. The girl's eyebrows drew together in fear. Her eyes filled with anxiety. In a commanding tone, Tess said that now they would remain together forever. Even as a child, Yuseniel was called the child who never cries. Even at birth, she did not shed a single tear, and many considered this creepy. Tess, in turn, was a famous crybaby. He could burst into tears as soon as he saw someone, so for people they were both strange. Everyone was worried that the crown prince had no friends, so the previous emperor arranged a meeting with Yuseniel, a similarly strange child. The adults hoped that the children would get along, and they were right. One day, little Tess turned to the girl and she looked at him attentively. Smiling sincerely, the boy admitted that he was no longer in pain. He said that his eyes were now comfortable. From then on, Tess followed little Harland around. He came to her house under any pretext. Although it was annoying, she was not angry. One day, the girl was in her room, surrounded by books and notes. She wanted to scream and cry because she had suffered another failure. Yuseniel clenched her fists tightly, not understanding how she could return to her world. Suddenly, someone called her from outside. The window swung open loudly and the girl saw Tess in it. He was holding a lush bouquet of flowers in his hands, saying how much he missed his friend. Seeing the aristocrat's upset face, Nosbel anxiously asked if she was ill. The girl was confused and remained silent for a few seconds. Then Yuseniel laughed and asked the boy to come through the door next time. Sometimes his presence gave her strength. Tess said that if they got married now, he wouldn't have to come to meet them. Harland replied that marriage was only allowed after 20. Previously, she thought that this was just a childish attachment of a naive boy. Now, in his gaze, there was a mania of grandeur and a desire for power. The aristocrat could admit that it really was love. However, she was frightened by the thought that he had managed to change so much just because of a couple of her words. Tesfalun lightly touched her chin with his finger, as if testing the fragility of glass. Without looking away, he began to slowly approach. Seeing the frozen face of his beloved, the prince asked what was the matter. He assumed that she was thinking about someone else while he was standing in front of her. The man smirked and said that it hurt his heart. Gradually closing the distance, he almost touched her lips, but then she came to her senses. Yuseniel blinked, looking away, and then looked at the prince. Confusion flickered across her face and her brows furrowed involuntarily. The aristocrat screamed and pushed Tesfalun away sharply. He staggered from surprise and raised his eyebrows in surprise. The girl continued to hold her hand outstretched, not allowing him to come closer. She carefully ordered the man to keep his hands to himself. Yuseniel took a deep breath. She said that if something like this happened again, she was not going to stand idly by. Holding his chest, Tess noted that it was as cold as ever. She asked if her words had really made him change his appearance. The man nodded, adding that he had even adjusted the emperor's regalia. He knew that the girl liked men who looked good in black. Prince Nosbel then asked Lady Harland what she thought of the changes that had taken place. She merely frowned, her lips pressed into a thin line. A cold sweat appeared on the aristocrat's cheek. She had no idea at what point they had reached such extremes. Without waiting for an answer, the man said that he could make all his jewelry the same color. For him, her words were law. After hearing this, Yuseniel asked the prince to tell her how he had managed to change so much. She noticed his hand trembling slightly. The man froze, looking down, not knowing what to answer. The girl raised her chin and demanded an answer immediately. Tesfalun realized that the aristocrat was genuinely interested in this question. He smiled and promised to reveal this secret only after their wedding. The aristocrat froze, raising her eyebrows in surprise. Her eyes widened in surprise. Shock and curiosity intertwined in her gaze. The prince acted at his own discretion. It was clear that he was not going to answer her questions. The girl thought that her family's exile to Valen was connected with the changes in his appearance and character. Disappointment flashed across her gaze and squeezed her chest. Yuseniel decided to end the conversation and turned to leave. She stated that she was going home. Tess followed her without hesitation. He suggested that they take a walk together, since they had often spent time at her estate before. The aristocrat refused, sighing heavily. The man said he had prepared a gift, but she coldly said she didn't need anything. Suddenly, the prince blocked Lady Harland's path. He handed her a pass that gave her the right to freely visit the Imperial Library at any time. Tess added that many new books had appeared, especially about magic. The girl could take any, except those that were kept in the forbidden section. The man took one of her long locks of hair carefully, as if he was afraid to disturb its shape. His fingers slid along the strand with tenderness and admiration. As Yuseniel examined the pass, the prince leaned closer, holding his breath, inhaling the subtle scent of her hair. Unable to restrain himself, he slowly touched his lips to a strand of hair, feeling its softness. The kiss was light, almost imperceptible. Yuseniel was frightened when she noticed Tess's actions. She jerked back, her eyes widened in horror, and she told him in a stern tone to stop. Suddenly, a black portal opened behind the prince and a cold wind swept through the space. He declared that he would wait for the lady in the palace. With a sad expression on his face, the man asked Yuseniel not to make him wait too long. He entered the portal almost completely. The girl didn't have time to say anything. Before disappearing, the prince said that even his patience had its limits, and then left a black trail behind him. The aristocrat was shocked by Nosbel's teleportation. She didn't even suspect that he had such a high-level magic under his control. The sky was clear. The wind barely stirred the leaves in the garden of the majestic palace. Against the background of silence, ringing blows were heard. The swords clashed with a clang in a furious fight. The birds took flight in fear, avoiding the area of the training battle. The man gathered all his strength to parry Yuseniel's powerful thrust. His arms shook with the effort, and he exhaled heavily, asking her to stop. Ethel Bonhart was a childhood friend of the young noblewoman. He stepped back, raising his hands in conciliation. His breath hitched, he suggested a break. The man noticed that she was not sparing herself at all in her training. Putting her sword back in its sheath, the girl calmly replied that it remained just as weak. Ethel gave in and sat down on the chair, allowing himself to relax. He said that only Yuseniel would dare to call the Emperor's knight weak. Bonhart noticed that she was too strong even for a girl with elven blood. She drank the water silently, not looking away and listening to him attentively. The man was amazed that Lady Harland, having just set foot on the capital's soil, immediately began studying at the Conceum. Despite the daily training, Yuseniel chuckled and asked if it was really just training that made him write so rarely. Ethel looked embarrassed and insisted that he sent her a lot of messages. The knight looked away awkwardly. He quietly admitted that he simply didn't know what to write to her. The girl ignored his excuse. She asked if he continued to visit the imperial palace after she moved to Valen. The aristocrat's tone suddenly changed, becoming agitated and wary. She asked him if he thought the prince had changed much. The man shrugged and replied that as a child, His Majesty only interacted with Yuseniel. He added that he had not noticed any changes in him. Having escaped from Tess that day, Lady Harland asked her father and all her acquaintances about him. However, everyone said that they had noticed no changes. After a brief pause, Ethel admitted that the prince seemed a little intimidating. The noblewoman asked him to elaborate. Bonhart noted that much blood had been spilled since Teswalin's ascension to the throne. He had proven to be a harsh and merciless ruler. The man looked at her seriously and asked her to stay away from His Majesty. There was a note of caution in his voice. Yuseniel thought about it, realizing the truth of her interlocutor's words. Her heart told her that she should have avoided meeting the prince. Now, looking at the imperial palace, the girl realized that this was impossible. She looked at the huge towers that stretched to the sky. The aristocrat could not miss such a chance to learn the magic she needed. She clutched the library pass tightly and walked forward. Prince Nosbel placed his palm on the glass, watching Yuseniel approaching. He had been waiting for her arrival for a long time, and his patience was at its limit. It seemed as if something was fluttering inside him. He involuntarily blushed with anticipation, and his lips spread into a slight smile. Lady Harland walked, carefully adjusting her hood to hide her face. Her steps were quick as she wanted to avoid unnecessary attention. In the great hall, 3 men were talking quietly, not attracting attention. One asked if the others had heard the news about the youngest daughter of the Marquis of Cheyenne. The gentleman added that she had been punished for insulting Lady Yuseniel Harland. Everyone already knew that Duke Harland and his family had been returned to the capital. The blonde suggested that the future empress could be a lady from their lineage. Yuseniel quietly passed by, involuntarily eavesdropping on the conversation. With a little annoyance, the aristocrat concluded that the rumors had already spread. Walking carefully down the corridor, she took a deep breath. The Northern Empire was supported by 2 powerful factions of aristocrats, each of which was determined to strengthen its influence. The first faction of aristocrats arose long before the other. They were supporters of the duchy, which played a key role in the founding of the empire. The second faction included the Marquis families. It was into their family that the first empress was born. The girl was the only lover of the previous ruler. She sought to make one of the Marquis's daughters the crown princess. However, at some point, Teswalin Nosbel became completely infatuated with Yuseniel. This made the empress give up and abandon her plans. This is why other nobles began to fear the Harland family. They believed that the first daughter was seeking to take the place of the next empress. Yuseniel had only recently returned to the capital, but there were already rumors that she had been visiting the palace often. She did not want her loved ones to suffer again. The aristocrat believed that it was because of her that the family was exiled to Valen for such a long time. She had no idea how much suffering they would have to endure. 14 years ago, the girl's family was invited to the emperor's reception room. Sitting on the throne, he first thanked her for her visit. Little Lady Harland knew at once that there was something wrong with the man. This discovery alarmed her. His Majesty looked completely exhausted. He said that he had called the noblewoman to ask her one question and asked her to answer honestly. The man stood up and slowly walked up to the girl. He asked her if she liked the color black and people with black hair and eyes. She nodded. The emperor suddenly burst into wild, frantic laughter that sounded terrifying, his face contorting into that of a psychopath. Yuseniel's mother stood up to protect her, blocking her way with her hands. The girl looked at her in fear, not understanding what was happening. The man began to scream furiously that even the priest could not help his son. He added that only the name of the daughter of the Harland family came out of his mouth. His Majesty called the girl slutty and filthy, taking a shaky breath. Seal hugged her, telling the Emperor to watch his language. Mother had proudly declared that elves were the embodiment of innocence and purity. Therefore, such accusations against Yuseniel were absolutely meaningless. The woman added that the future fate of Nazbel's son was the result of his own decisions. Therefore, he should not have taken out his anger on her child. The Emperor wearily clutched his head. Looking at the noblewoman, he ordered that this child be sent to Valen and that she remain there forever. The guards approached the girl, but her father began to shout that they could not send Yuseniel alone. He suggested exiling their entire family. The little noblewoman tried to object, but Emperor Nazbel firmly stated that this was how it would be. His decision was final. His Majesty headed for the exit. He quietly stated that this was the only and best way out of the situation. Yuseniel froze, overcome with shock and despair, her heart clenching in despair as she realized that nothing could be changed. And again the girl stood before the familiar doors. They awakened in her sad, long-forgotten memories. The aristocrat did not expect that she would one day be able to return to this palace. Taking a deep breath, she stood there for a few more seconds. Snorting with obvious disdain, Yuseniel turned and left. She muttered to herself that this place as before was not a drop of hospitality. Tesfaloon hid behind a nearby column. He silently and thoughtfully watched the girl, his gaze wary. Having found the library, the aristocrat entered and gasped in surprise. The spaciousness of the hall was astonishing. The shelves stretched upward and seemed to disappear into the air. She walked slowly along the countless bookshelves, unable to tear her eyes away. Her fingers slid along the spines. Her eyes greedily caught the titles. Yuseniel was amazed to see that the library had grown considerably in size. A joyful smile spread across her face, and her eyes sparkled. Suddenly, the girl heard quiet steps behind her. An unfamiliar voice asked who the visitor was. The older man put on his monocle, trying to get a better look at the brunette. He started to say that only family members could be here, but then he stopped. The librarian instantly recognized Yuseniel. His face lit up with joy and he shouted her name with delight, spreading his arms. Smiling, the aristocrat gently asked the man to be quiet. They walked up the stairs, daylight streaming in from the huge windows. Yuseniel noticed that despite the passage of 14 years, the old man remained the same. He chuckled. The man, gesturing vigorously, said that His Majesty had mentioned the girl's arrival. After a pause, he added that it had been quite a while. Seeing her eyes, the old man explained that it had happened shortly after taking the throne. Nazbel had ordered books to be found on all the topics of her childhood. The aristocrat clutched the hem of her dress, realizing that the prince had not forgotten about her. The librarian continued to conduct the tour, pointing to the forbidden area. Finally, the old man offered his help if she needed it. The girl smiled and expressed her sincere gratitude. Yuseniel picked up a stack of closed books and placed them on the table with a bang, creating a slight vibrational sound. Yuseniel sat down, holding the book comfortably in front of her. Every now and then she calmly turned the pages. As she read, the girl was overcome by disturbing thoughts. She thought about the words of the previous emperor before her family was exiled, and about the changes in Tess. Prince Nazbel had remembered her all this time and had brought her family back once he had gained power. The realization of these facts made Lady Harland uneasy. She didn't hate the life of an aristocrat in Valen. It was a barren land where the snow never melted. Luckily, Yuseniel found a good teacher who taught her how to wield a sword. By spending hours training, she avoided rumors and jealousy. However, the girl was troubled by another thought. Her family did not want to live in exile. Moreover, it was not easy to find books about magic in that place. For this reason, the aristocrat was forced to abandon hope of returning to her world. Yuseniel lowered her head and stared at one point. She understood that Tess was not at all to blame for what happened. Then she woke up, hearing a sound. However, she couldn't pretend that nothing had happened. The man suddenly appeared and calmly sat down next to the girl. She spoke the prince's name with a slight wariness and awkwardness in her voice. Her intonation was questioning. Tess rested his cheek on his palm, barely holding back a satisfied grin. He listened attentively to Lady Harland, not taking his keen gaze off her. When she came to the library, the aristocrat deliberately did not include her name on the list of visitors. She did not understand how he knew about her presence. Exhaling, Yuseniel asked him why he was following her. She added that his behavior seemed childish. The man replied that he simply loved her. The girl pushed back her chair and stood up. She asked why no one noticed the changes in his appearance since everyone was sure that he remained the same. Prince Nazbel noticed the noblewoman's hand on his shoulder. He asked her not to leave, looking at her with a slight worry in his eyes. Tesfalun asked if she was really curious. At that moment, he quickly grabbed her hand, skillfully intertwining her fingers, not wanting to let go. The man smirked and declared that this made him incredibly happy. He gently pulled their clasped hands closer and brushed his lips lightly over them. Tez suddenly licked her fingers boldly without looking away. With a smile, he whispered that Yuseniel was incredibly sweet. The girl blushed slightly and frowned deeply. She clenched her free hand tightly into a fist, trying to contain her emotions. She jerked her hand out of the prince's grasp and then grabbed him by the collar of his shirt, lifting him into the air, her eyes full of determination and anger. Yuseniel gathered all her strength in her hand and pushed the man onto the table. His face showed complete shock and amazement, because he didn't even have time to react. The aristocrat loomed over Tez and reminded him in a stern voice that she would not tolerate such behavior any longer. There were still some blushes on her face. Lady Harland loomed over the man, her hands on the table, her long hair hanging down, her breathing ragged with exertion. A second passed and the atmosphere became awkward. Tesfalun involuntarily exhaled, trying to contain his emotions and regain control. The prince suddenly laughed, surprised by the girl's strength. She replied irritably that it was so, and advised him not to bother her anymore. The aristocrat wanted to say a few more words, but he hugged her tightly. Pulling her to himself, he added that he liked to remain in this position. Tess's smile was genuine and wide, and his eyes were shining with joy. His lips spread into an open and warm smile. Yuseniel closed her eyes, clenching her jaw as her body shook slightly with anger, every muscle tensing as she tried to contain her growing rage. With all her strength, the girl sent the prince into the nearest bookstand. Several books fell with a crash and notes on paper scattered around the room. Prince Nazbel let out a pitiful gasp and began rubbing the back of his head. The noblewoman merely glanced at him with disdain, not hiding her displeasure. The man complimented Lady Harland's blow, calling it incredibly powerful. She merely told him to be grateful that she had not used her full force. Tesfalun nodded as if he knew this. He added that the girl had found a wonderful fencing teacher in Valen. Nazbel then noted that the noblewoman's figure had become much slimmer. She realized that the prince knew about her sword training. Yuseniel still couldn't believe that this was the same crybaby she knew. It wasn't just the looks, it was the man himself. The girl had been haunted by this bad feeling for the last few days. She felt terribly uneasy, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from him. Tess immediately noticed how the aristocrat was looking at him. Perhaps it was only because his appearance matched her taste. Yuseniel thought that Tess did look quite attractive. Feeling another rush of blood to her face, she turned away. The man chuckled, realizing that the girl really liked his new look. He was glad that he was able to attract her attention. The sun was slowly sinking below the horizon. The aristocrat asked again how he had changed the color of his eyes and hair and why no one had noticed. Yuseniel lowered her voice and demanded an answer. There was a seriousness in her tone. Tess was silent for a moment, clearly considering what to say. Prince Nazbel stated that he was connected to this palace. The girl's face immediately reflected confusion. She did not understand what exactly he meant. The first ruler conquered the north of the continent and founded an empire. However, threats from neighbors and the southern power remained serious. In addition, there were always nobles nearby who interfered with the power of Tesfalun's ancestor. Any of them could betray him without hesitation. It was for this reason that the ruler associated himself with the imperial palace. He needed to keep an eye on everyone who was within its walls. This ability was passed down from generation to generation. It was invariably awakened in the next heir to the throne. Prince Nazbel raised his chin and confidently concluded that the palace was his domain. Yuseniel, stunned, admitted that she had not even suspected it. The man explained that this was only communicated to the heir personally. Besides, his abilities were much stronger than those of his predecessors. With a slight grin, Tesfalun noted that once someone entered the palace, they would immediately gain the power to change other people's memories. Hearing this, the girl involuntarily touched her head. A sudden pain flared up and responded with a pulsating echo. Yuseniel couldn't believe that he had told her this without blinking an eye. His face remained surprisingly calm and serene. Taking a breath, the girl said that the entire nobility of the empire was supposed to be present at the coronation. No wonder no one noticed any changes. The prince waved his hand and praised the noblewoman for her intelligence. However, her face still showed her inner turmoil. It is very strange that the emperor's powers were passed down to his descendants for so many years. Even if he had incredibly powerful mana, Lady Harland thought about it and concluded that it was possible if there was something more involved. She should delve deeper into the world's magic. Suddenly, the aristocrat asked why her memories were left untouched. There was genuine confusion in her voice. The man immediately replied that the reason was the elven blood flowing through her veins. The girl froze, trying to comprehend what she had heard. Tesfalun continued that the power of the imperial family did not affect the children of light. They included the elves and fairies. Yuseniel asked carefully if the prince was worried about what was happening. Her words soft but filled with concern. Seeing the bewilderment on the boy's face, Lady Harland hinted that she could tell the people the emperor's secret. He suddenly approached her. For a moment it seemed as if Tess's gaze was directed into nothing. The girl forced herself to finish saying that he was playing with people's memories. Suddenly the prince's expression became exactly like that boy's. Innocent look, raised eyebrows as if he were a child again. Yuseniel felt ashamed. This feeling was creeping up quietly but persistently. And yet the desire to provoke Tesfalun prevailed. The girl thought that this was her way of getting back at him for 14 years of silence. She hoped that it would hurt him at least a little. After a pause, the man said that Yuseniel would never do that to him. She pursed her lips. Prince Nosbel gently pressed the noblewoman's palm to his cheek. He said warmly that no one had ever been on his side except her. The interlocutor clenched her teeth tightly. She did not know what to do now and how to act. Thinking over what she had heard, Yuseniel jerked her hand away and realized that Tess was right. She really had always been there, but there was one more disturbing detail that was emerging. The aristocrat made it clear that it was impossible to close one's eyes to all the changes in the man. He froze in surprise. The girl declared that she had had enough and turned around, intending to leave. The prince, confused, asked her to stop. Tess decided to remind Lady Harland of her words. She likes exactly such men. He admitted that he was confused and immediately began to apologize. Yuseniel jerked the door handle. The lock clanked and the doors swung open. The man threatened that if she left, Lily Cheyenne would be executed. The girl's heart did not waver. She calmly told him to do as he wanted. Deep down, she only hoped that it was just a cruel joke. The prince asked desperately if the aristocrat really hated him. She froze, her eyes ready to fill with tears from the strain. Yuseniel closed her eyes, gathering her thoughts, beads of sweat appearing on her forehead. Taking a deep breath, she bid His Majesty farewell with restraint. The girl quietly slammed the door behind her. Tesfalun remained standing in the shadows, and a deep sadness lay on his face, as if he had lost something dear. The aristocrat leaned tiredly against the door, leaning her whole body against it. A man's voice could be heard inside. He was quietly pronouncing her name, as if calling out to her. Yuseniel didn't hate the prince's new appearance. She needed time to think it over carefully. They should stay away from each other for a while. Lady Harland took a deep breath, pulled herself together and headed home. Tesfalun stood hunched over by the door, muttering quietly to himself, as if he couldn't find peace and needed something. The boy cried quietly. Alone, he prayed and begged Yuseniel not to leave, afraid that without her he would go crazy. Yuseniel walked slowly down the long corridor, lost in thought. She went over what had happened in her head, trying to figure out what to do next. The man's words about how she hated him echoed in the aristocrat's ears. They did not let go of her, like a heavy burden on her heart. An image of that little boy with blonde hair appeared in her head. The girl thought that someone could have hurt him deeply back then. Lady Harland recalled the prince's words that she had always been on his side. She soon came to the conclusion that this was indeed true. Little Tess ran with a book in his hands, beaming with joy. In any situation, he smiled and rushed to Yuseniel, finding support and warmth in her. The girl remembered the times when it seemed to her that only one prince would be by my side. At last the boy caught up with little Lady Harland, clinging to her arm. His face lit up with unbridled joy. Now they would study together. Yuseniel awkwardly explained that it was only because he had asked to take her with him. He remained silent, only laughing merrily in response. The aristocrat understood perfectly well that she could not refuse. This was her first and only chance to learn from the Archmage himself. Tess began to rub gently against the girl, because her happiness filled him with joy. She frowned with displeasure. Lady Harland grabbed Tess by the cheeks and pulled him away from her with obvious irritation, making it clear to him that he should leave her alone. The boy gasped and ran his hand over his cheeks. Yuseniel's trust in Tess was as strong then as his in her. The children approached the Archmage's office and quickly entered. On his desk lay a large globe, an hourglass, and an amazing notebook. A man stood before them. The girl greeted him loudly and introduced herself as Yuseniel Harland, addressing the Archmage with respect. The aristocrat curtsied perfectly, carefully holding the hem of her yellow dress. Then she looked at the teacher. The old man was the most powerful mage in the Empire. He looked at his new student with a satisfied expression. Perhaps this man knew how to travel between worlds. Then the girl thought that he could sense that she had been reborn. The Archmage chuckled and noted that Yuseniel was indeed as polite as His Majesty had assured him. The boy laughed. Tesfaloon began to say that Lady Harland was very clever, incredibly kind and beautiful. Behind him stood patiently the servants and even the knight. Beaming with joy, the boy said that Yuseniel would one day become his wife. She only sighed heavily in response, holding back her anger. Yuseniel glanced tensely over her shoulder at the people behind her. How Tess could blurt out such a thing in front of the Empress's servants was beyond her understanding. The aristocrat hissed at the boy that she had taught him not to speak like that. He frowned and blushed with shame, not understanding why he had received the reproach. Lady Harland cleared her throat and politely addressed the Archmage. She stated that she had a question, and he looked at her curiously. The girl asked if the teacher knew the fairy tale, The Angel and the Woodcutter of Mount Guanasan. Tess noted that he had seen it in the Imperial Library. The story was about a woodcutter who decided to steal the clothes of an angel who was bathing in a lake on Mount Guanasan. The angel fell in love with the woodcutter, but eventually returned back to heaven. As a rule, such tales are based on real events. Yuseniel inquired about the characters. She asked if the messenger of God who came to Earth and the man who lived there were from different worlds. The girl assumed that the angel could have entered another reality. It was similar to her case when she was reborn in this world. Gathering her courage, the aristocrat took a deep breath. Her eyes lit up and she asked if the transition between worlds was really possible. The older man scratched his beard thoughtfully. He grinned and called the new student's question interesting. The Archmage then replied that the answer most likely had to do with mana as well. For centuries, the lands near the Guanasan Mountains had been famous for its abundance. That's why the use of mana on this mountain is not accidental. With the right amount of effort, it is quite possible to open a gate to another world there. Yuseniel's eyes lit up with joy, as if stars had lit up in them. She could hardly hold her breath in delight, because she had finally found her way home. The girl rose from her chair about to voice a proposal. However, the Archmage interrupted her, not letting her say a word. The old man said that no one knew how to do this before. The smile immediately disappeared from the student's face and her gaze dimmed with disappointment. Gritting her teeth, Lady Harland clasped her hands tightly. Catching her gaze, he explained that the angel could only travel because of his origin. The Archmage added that humans would never reach such heights. Yuseniel despaired because she thought she had finally found a solution. Tesfaloon raised his eyebrows in confusion as he looked at the girl. He clearly didn't understand what was going on. Noticing how the student had drooped, the man said that Mount Guanasan had long been considered a mystery. Somewhere there was definitely a hidden path between the worlds. The teacher pointed out that the ancient dragons and gods might know more about this. But the girl only sighed. She understood that this was just a consolation. Prince Nazbel feverishly searched for a question, hoping to somehow brighten the silence. When he finally spoke, the girl shuddered in surprise. Tesfaloon asked if the demons knew anything about traveling between worlds. The eyes of the interlocutor opened in surprise. The Archmage, with horror in his voice, did not understand how His Highness could think of such a thing. He ordered him not to speak of these sinful creatures anymore. The man added that demons are insidious creatures who tempt people with their sweet words. However, the boy did not listen to him, trying to console his friend. A quiet night fell, and the stars scattered across the sky. Even in the moonlight, the imperial palace remained majestic and beautiful. Yuseniel sat in a large bed, engrossed in a book. Next to her, in the soft light of a lantern, lay the little prince, smiling at his friend. Unable to restrain himself, the boy moved closer to the aristocrat. He joyfully declared that he was incredibly happy to be allowed to sleep in her room. Lady Harland clucked her tongue in displeasure and explained that Tess had merely thrown a tantrum near her carriage. He merely chuckled sheepishly. Yuseniel exhaled and asked not to blame her if Her Majesty did give her a scolding. He replied that she should have stayed in his palace. The aristocrat explained that she couldn't sleep. The atmosphere of the place was too oppressive. Tess replied that she was simply too nice. The prince began that the palace was indeed gloomy, and the only ray of light in it was Yuseniel. She was surprised. Tesfaloon said that this was why they should get married soon. Taking the girl by surprise, he suddenly pulled her close and kissed her on the cheek. The aristocrat got angry and blushed at the same time. The boy giggled contentedly and wished her sweet dreams, hiding under a large blanket. Lady Yuseniel was sometimes irritated by her friend's tears and selfishness. However, she enjoyed receiving the love he gave her. He suddenly reached out and gently stroked her palm, telling her not to worry. The little prince promised to make her every wish come true. His blue eyes were shining. Lady Harlan said that he did not know her wishes, but she thanked him anyway and lay down next to him, touching her head. The heroine fell into a deep sleep. From afar, cries of great blood loss after a knife stab could be heard. Preparations for a transfusion were underway. A few seconds later, Yuseniel realized she was having that dream again. She felt a familiar, uneasy feeling. The bloodied girl's mother hung over the bed, crying desperately through her tears, begging her daughter to come to her senses. Lady Harlan was truly sorry to leave her own family. Suddenly she felt ill and began to lose her balance. Suddenly, Yuseniel was overcome by unbearable pain. It seemed like she was being torn apart, and she was already sitting in her own blood. Blood was streaming from her nose and her vision was blurry. The girl bewilderedly called her mother for help, unable to cope with the pain. She heard distant cries of her name. It turned out that Tess was shaking her, trying to wake her up and bring her back to consciousness. The boy was still trying to wake his friend up, squeezing her shoulders. His eyes were filled with fear, mixed with despair and anxiety. Yuseniel frowned in displeasure and asked him to get off her. He screamed in fear and immediately crawled back. The little prince blushed and apologized. He swore that he just wanted the girl to wake up and not frighten him with her silence. Lady Harlan said with a grin that she had no doubt. She adjusted her hair coquettishly and turned away as he asked if she was teasing him again. The boy frowned in resentment, looking away. He quietly muttered that he had indeed spoken the truth. Tesfaloon explained that she had been muttering about pain in her sleep. The cheeky grin instantly vanished from Yuseniel's face. The girl looked down in disappointment. She still clearly remembered the piercing pain from the knife piercing her flesh. Even after reincarnating into Yuseniel's body, she often had dreams about her past life, especially about being stabbed by a thief or dying in the hospital. It was as if this world knew she didn't belong here and was trying to push her back in. She whispered that it felt like a curse. Tesfaloon barely heard her words. Leaning closer, he quietly asked what exactly she had muttered. The aristocrat waved it off, calling it a trifle. The boy pouted and mumbled that he had only come with good intentions. The prince confessed that he wanted to kiss Lady Harlan. She smiled back, but in her heart she felt a slight disgust. The girl suddenly jumped out of bed and said it was time for breakfast. Tesfaloon lazily asked her to wait a little. The children sat down at a table where there was strawberry pie, shrimp noodles, and spare ribs, delicious pieces of meat. Elle's drawn-out name was heard from the hallway. The girl's joyful mother ran into the room, smiling and hurrying to her. Ciel enthusiastically picked up her daughter and spun her around, wishing her a good morning. The girl gasped in surprise, not having time to say anything. Yuseniel felt dizzy from the sudden movements. She noted her mother's incredible strength, but she only smiled and reminded her that she was an elf. Ciel suddenly showered her daughter with kisses on the cheek, hugging her tenderly. She declared that their baby was still too young to sleep separately. Suddenly, the father came up from behind and quietly addressed his wife. She didn't even flinch. She just calmly turned around, as if she had long felt him nearby. Milan decided to remind her that the crown prince was here today. He gently ran his hand over his beloved's shoulder, and she nodded in agreement. Mother gently placed her daughter back on the chair, and she breathed a sigh of relief. Tess smiled and greeted the Duchess of Harland. Daylight softly filled the huge room. Everything around shone in golden white tones, giving the place a solemn lightness. The family gathered around the table, immersed in a quiet dinner. The only sound in the room was the soft clatter of cutlery, creating a calm atmosphere. Tesfaloon suddenly felt weak in his arms. Seeing his frowning face, the noblewoman was slightly surprised at first, trying to understand the reason. The boy complained of sharp pains in his fingers. Yuseniel suddenly shuddered with alarm. The girl immediately offered to swap plates with her friend. She did so, noting that her meat was already sliced. Little Lady Harland raised Tess's hand, wondering if he had hurt himself again. But Tess himself was more concerned about her reaction. With some praise, Seal concluded that her daughter had always looked after the crown prince. She only gave a sullen look. After examining Nosbel's hand, Yuseniel quietly admitted that she was simply worried. Only she knew that Tess was constantly in pain. The aristocrat looked at her mother, lost in thought. The members of her new family were alive and well, but in her past life everything was different. Her biological father abandoned the family for another woman, which is why her mother had to raise her alone. The woman had always been in poor health, and after her husband left, the situation became much worse. However, she still promised to take care of and love her child. And so it was, because her mother gave the girl all her love. With sorrow, she recalled that she too was often in pain. Whenever Yuseniel looked at Tesfaloon, she immediately remembered her mother. That was why she tried so hard to look after him. When she noticed a nosebleed, the girl would immediately report it and reach for a napkin. Such situations happened to Crown Prince Nosbel quite often. The aristocrat noted their similarity with a grin. Both were clumsy crybabies, like mirror images in their troubles and feelings. Despite the pain, both of them kept smiling, as if they were trying to hide their anxiety behind a calm mask so as not to worry others. Yuseniel was completely despondent, overcome with longing for her mother. She worried about her, whispering mental prayers that everything would be okay with her mother. She did not hate her parents from this world at all. On the contrary, she felt a strong gratitude towards them for the sincere love they gave her. The girl's heart began to beat faster, and her mother's painful words flashed in her head. She knew that she had no one left except her. Yuseniel needed to return to her world as soon as possible. She believed that then these nightmares would stop. Besides, the ancient dragons and gods might know something about this. The first lesson with the elderly archmage popped into my head again. Taking a deep breath, the girl turned decisively to her mother. The latter almost choked in surprise, hearing such a confident tone. Yuseniel said that she had heard that elves and fairies were very different from humans. Ciel was slightly surprised by such a leading question. The girl asked if she knew how to travel between worlds. She smiled sincerely with curiosity, barely containing her anxiety. The aristocrat clearly understood that she would have to return back. However, she did not even think that there were 100 days left before her family was expelled from the capital. Ciel asked with slight concern why this particular question had upset her daughter so much. There was concern and confusion in her voice. Lady Harland tensed slightly, wincing. For a moment she thought it would be much easier to tell the truth and ask for help. However, the couple always loved Yuseniel as their own daughter. She could not simply say that she wanted to return to her world from the very beginning. The girl replied that even after the Archmage's lecture, she didn't understand everything. She added that her mother was the only elf in the capital and could know more. Ciel immediately shared her pleasant emotions with her husband. She was extremely delighted, because Elle asked to help her with her studies. Yuseniel felt a little awkward about being deceived. She tried to remain calm, although something inside her was pricking unpleasantly. The woman scratched her ear thoughtfully. She explained that, unfortunately, she couldn't tell her daughter anything. The aristocrat exploded with questions, not understanding why. She asked if her mother hadn't come from the fairy realm. Ciel calmly explained that this was highly classified information. Hearing the disappointment in her daughter's voice, she only smiled slightly and pitifully. Unlike the fairies who lived in those lands from birth to death, the elves lived among humans. They were strictly ordered to keep all information secret. Trying to find the right words, Ciel explained that it could be called a treaty. It always allowed the world to maintain balance. Yuseniel asked eagerly if this was a divine contract. If so, she wondered which gods had created it. The girl added that there were supposedly 2 of them on the continent. Looking down, the mother said that she simply did not know. After hearing this, the aristocrat immediately became depressed, having suffered a complete failure. Her own mother was her last hope, which was now destroyed. Yuseniel and the crown prince were in the library. The boy watched in amazement as the books fell one after another to the floor with a dull thud. Unable to bear the inherent chaos of the scattered books any longer, Tesfaloon turned to his friend. With excitement in his voice, he suggested that she take a break. However, the girl did not pay attention to her friend. She was looking for a book with great concentration, not intending to stop. Unexpectedly, Yuseniel exclaimed joyfully, for she had found what she was looking for. They sank to the floor together and she began reading with rapt attention. At the very beginning of time there was a god of light, Lux. As expected, he was opposed by a god of darkness known as the devil. Lux created this continent and educated people. He tried his best to protect them from the devil's temptations. After many centuries, the gods disappeared, and the inhabitants of the continent were divided into believers and atheists. The armor of the former seemed to shine with an inner light. The atheists wore different armor and cloaks, and their flag symbolized the struggle. Thus began a real war that flared up between the two worlds. Lady Harland could not believe that there was no further mention of deities. Tess watched his friend closely. The rest of the book was just about the confrontation between the Northern and Southern empires, and about the victory of the first emperor. Unlike the Southern Empire, the Northern Empire had no official religion. As a result, theology there remained underdeveloped and little known. Yuseniel believed that since most of the Northern Empire believed in Lux, she would be able to find more data. She sighed heavily. Unable to bear it any longer, Lady Harland fell wearily to the floor. She said quietly and indifferently that all efforts had been useless. Tesfaloon lay down on the floor facing Yuseniel. He smiled at her strange behavior, as if enjoying the moment with her. Yuseniel asked him if he didn't need to go back to the palace. The boy replied that he wanted to stay there longer. The aristocrat asked if he was really that much in love with her. Tess joyfully exclaimed that it was the pure truth. The Crown Prince admitted that they would have a wonderful life together. For some reason, Lady Harland was surprised. Her eyes widened. Tess's mother and father always told him that he should marry a very kind girl. As he said this, the boy blushed. Yuseniel jumped up, rubbing her head in confusion. She had sternly warned Tesfaloon not to repeat this in front of strangers, but he still hadn't understood the reason. Lady Harland knew perfectly well that the Crown Prince's mother would not allow their marriage. She did everything possible to bring him together with Lady Cheyenne. The girl looked at Tess in bewilderment, not believing her eyes. She didn't understand whether he really didn't know this. The aristocrat concluded that both had not yet reached marriageable age. Tess asked with interest whether it was true that he would have to wait until he was 20. Yuseniel reminded her friend of her preferences. Tess frowned, realizing that she didn't like crybabies at all. He muttered that the girl would choose a powerful but not arrogant mage with hair the color of the night sky and dark eyes. The aristocrat nodded softly, acknowledging His Highness's words. She confidently added that he was absolutely right and there was no arguing with that. Lady Harland rose confidently and announced that they must go. Suddenly the boy grabbed the hem of her dress. Tesfaloon asked what the blondes with blue eyes could do. He couldn't accept that he had no chance at all. Yuseniel looked at him in surprise, and the boy seemed to start crying even more. His eyes widened, full of pleading. The girl suddenly pulled her hand away, cutting off his pleas. She sternly stated that he was already acting like a crybaby. The aristocrat calmly added that her type would never change. These words seemed to penetrate deeper into his heart, making him feel pain. Tess jumped up and hugged her, begging her to say that she liked him at least a little. He began to promise everything he could and give her the best jewelry in the world. Lady Harland spoke the Crown Prince's name in an icy voice. Nosbel shuddered and froze in place, not daring to say another word. Yuseniel said that throwing a tantrum would never get the boy what he wanted. She had to pull his hand off her dress again. The girl declared that Teswalin was not able to win her heart. He lowered his head and apologized quietly, barely containing his disappointment. The aristocrat gently suggested that the boy go. She reminded him that it was time for him to return to the palace. The Crown Prince clenched his fists tightly, muttering quietly to himself that he couldn't leave things as they were. Yuseniel asked him what he had said. Tesfaloon stubbornly refused to return, could not bear the thought of being separated from her again. The girl asked twice before he finally came to. Wiping away his tears, the boy suddenly smiled radiantly and said that he agreed to leave if the aristocrat took his hand. There was hope in his gaze. Sighing wearily, the girl nevertheless agreed and extended her hand. She hurried him, reminding him that they were already late. Yuseniel had always been kind to Tess. However, this was not enough for him. He dreamed of all her love, but did not yet know how to deserve it. The clanking of swords could be heard near the imperial palace. Fencing training was underway. The ringing echoed throughout the area. The little Crown Prince watched Lady Harland's precise and impressive movements with wide eyes, rapt. Tess exclaimed that the girl was simply incredible. She barely parried the blow, embarrassed by the sudden support. Looking at the panting student, Count Guard smiled contentedly. He was formerly the captain of the Imperial Knights, and now he is the bodyguard of the Crown Prince. The man offered the young swordswoman a little rest. He praised the girl's skills and asked if she had already learned to wield a sword. Tesfaloon ran up to her friend with a small towel in his hand. Yuseniel wanted to answer, but a familiar voice interrupted her with a greeting. It turned out to be 8-year-old Ethel Bonhart. He explained that the girl had missed her last fencing lesson, so he had come to visit her. The boy bowed politely, glad that the Count himself was present at the lesson. Tess was noticeably dejected due to Yuseniel's lack of attention. Ethel asked in a friendly tone if the aristocrat had been training extra with Guard, since she had been winning a lot lately. Then he chuckled. Yuseniel chuckled and said that he was only losing because of his own weakness. For some reason, this began to irritate Crown Prince Nosbel. Tesvalin tugged at Lady Harlan's shirt, trying to get her attention. Bonhart finally saw His Highness and greeted him awkwardly but politely. The little prince interrupted the boy abruptly and rushed towards him. He furiously demanded that he leave immediately. Yuseniel and Ethel didn't have time to react. Tess grabbed him by the collar and shouted, asking who gave him permission to come here whenever he wanted. The boy sternly declared that Lady Harlan should be only with him today. After that, he slapped the brunette with all his might. The bodyguard stepped between them, telling the prince to pull himself together so as not to faint again. He was still screaming, demanding that Ethel be taken away. Yuseniel felt like she had finally gotten through to Tess, but he was still obsessed with her, oblivious to everything around him. The noblewoman approached Ethel Bonhart with concern, asking if he was okay. He nodded slightly shocked. Tesvalin suddenly began to whine hysterically, unable to hold back his tears. In a trembling voice, he cried out that he was in much more pain than the other guy. The girl drooped. Over time, the prince's outbursts of anger became stronger. Then he tried to protect Yuseniel not only from Ethel, but from the others as well. The aristocrat recalled an incident at a ball when she was paired with Bonhart. Tess, flushed with jealousy, shouted at her to forbid her to communicate with others. This left the Harland family at the center of rumors, with many believing that they were trying to make their daughter a crown princess. People were surprised by Tess's behavior and decided that he must have been brainwashed. However, Yuseniel never considered communication with the boy a problem. The aristocrat naively continued to believe that all these feelings were due to a slight attachment to her. She often tried to calm him down. The girl sincerely said that no matter who the other became for her, Tesfaloon would always remain her dear friend. The boy lowered his head, touched, and then nodded happily. Words like these always brought Nosbel comfort. The crown prince thanked the aristocrat and admitted with a bitter smile that he really liked her. Soon he began to grow rapidly. One day, Mother noticed with curiosity that the crown prince had not shown up for a long time. She asked if he and Yuseniel had quarreled. Her husband came up behind her and said he had heard about the difficulty walking due to her growth spurt. She couldn't believe it was so painful. Yuseniel had made numerous requests to visit the prince, but they had all been rejected. The wife concluded that the rumors were true. It was obvious that the young aristocrat was nervous. Her movements seemed constrained and uncertain, as if each one was difficult. Noticing something was wrong, Seal asked her daughter what was wrong. She assumed that she was upset because she had not seen the crown prince for a long time. Yuseniel shook her head, shuddering. She explained that she was sorry to miss the opportunity to attend magic lessons at the palace. Taking a small sip of hot tea, the woman looked at the child with distrust. Mylene leaned towards his wife and tenderly kissed her on the cheek. After some thought, Seal suggested using this opportunity to study with Ethel more often. The girl was slightly surprised by this suggestion. Mother explained that it would be better if the children eventually got engaged. Father suddenly exhaled, his reaction a mixture of shock and bewilderment. The man asked his wife if she was joking. She replied that Yuseniel should stay away from the crown prince. The girl asked if she was worried about the rumors, but her mother just laughed. She explained that getting close to Tez would most likely harm her. At that moment, Seal was completely serious. She confidently stated that her elf intuition warned her. Yuseniel remembered that Mother Vestma had spoken unflatteringly about Tessia recently. This made her think about what she had heard. The engagement was not a bad option. As soon as she had a fiancé, Tess would have to accept it, and the interest of others in her family would disappear. This course of events seemed quite logical. However, the aristocrat slammed the book shut and firmly declared that this would not happen. Looking at her parents' shocked faces, the girl explained that she had no intention of getting close to anyone. They sighed thoughtfully. Yuseniel will eventually return to her world. While she is here, she is not allowed to have close relationships with anyone. Lady Harland forced the sweetest smile she could muster. She confidently asked her parents not to worry about her relationship with the Swallen. In conclusion, the girl added that the Crown Prince was like a younger brother to her. After these words, she quietly left the room. However, contrary to what was said, during their next meeting, Tess seemed more like an elder. The friend happily greeted the aristocrat. Yuseniel felt a slight panic when she saw Nobzel. He was almost a head taller than her, and this surprised her more than she expected. Unaccustomed to it, the girl addressed her friend with a respectful title, as if he were a real monarch. He only smiled and asked her not to bow. The guy said that he had sent away all the guards, and now they were alone. Gently taking his girlfriend's hand, he asked her to forget about any formalities. Teswallen said that if the girl continued to treat him as a stranger, his heart would break into pieces. Then he kissed her hand tenderly. The boy gently touched her palm with his cheek as if seeking warmth in this gesture. A sweet, sincere smile lit up his face. Then he laughed softly and pointed at Yuseniel's face, which had turned noticeably red. There was a slight teasing warmth in his gaze. The aristocrat, slightly stumbling, ordered him to be quiet, and then turned away. She explained this by saying that she felt sick every time in the palace. The girl noticed that because of the constant glances directed at them, she always had to be on guard. Tesvalun calmly asked his friend not to worry. He added that there was no need to bow her head before him, and that he himself could simplify the rules. The boy confidently said that he would provide Yuseniel with freedom of movement throughout the empire. She looked at him in surprise, not believing that the laws could be changed. Suddenly, a cold wind rushed through the window and ran through the room. The white curtains rose and fluttered, as if they had come to life for a moment. The girl felt strange, as if something had changed around her. Putting a finger to his lips, Tesvalun said that he would keep it a secret for now. Nosbel earnestly asked Lady Harland to be patient, looking her straight in the eyes. At that moment, the wind gently stirred her long hair. At that moment, the aristocrat was unable to clearly see her friend's face. She felt her elven intuition awaken for the first time. Yuseniel felt that something was definitely wrong. After their meeting, Tess locked himself in the palace again. Soon demons appeared in the empire. Because of the events that had happened, the girl quickly forgot about everything else. Her thoughts were completely absorbed by the present. After a while, the imperial palace was filled with guests. The square was brightly decorated with flowers and ribbons, shining in the rays of the sun. It was Tess's 6th birthday. This day promised to be special and full of joy. Despite this, Tess's face looked very sad. There were 35 days left before the Harland family was expelled from the capital. The imperial palace was filled with noisy guests. In the square, the crowd shouted joyfully, raising clouds of bright confetti into the sky. In the banquet hall near the wide staircase of white marble, covered with a scarlet carpet, guests were crowded. They were talking loudly among themselves. It was the first formal reception after the prince's recovery. Nobility came from all over the country. Everyone dreamed of showing off at court. The Duke of Harland's family entered the great hall, and the guests greeted them loudly. A moment later, whispers and glances were heard in the hall. Guests whispered that Yuseniel's dress was a gift from the emperor himself. They said that it was thanks to her that the crown prince recovered and began to shine again. The gossips had no idea that the girl had heard every whisper. Sighing heavily, she became more and more homesick with each passing minute. The noblewoman reluctantly looked up and saw Lady Orin Cheyenne. The girls bowed respectfully, and behind them conversations began again. The crowd whispered that Lady Cheyenne had an ill will toward Lady Harland because of the struggle for the title of crown princess. The feud seemed terrible. Yuseniel felt sickened by the behavior of some of the guests. Suddenly, the huge white doors began to creak open, and the crowd froze in anticipation. The imperial family solemnly entered the banquet hall. The guests burst into joyful exclamations, filling the hall with warmth and delight. The empress smiled reservedly, and the emperor remained serious. Only little Tez looked away, as if he didn't know what to do with himself. One wave of his hand was enough to silence the hall. The emperor demanded silence and ordered everyone to stand up straight and raise their heads. Looking around the luxurious hall, the man praised his wife for her good work. Then he gently kissed her temple and she giggled. Yuseniel concluded that His Majesty was still devoted to his wife. There was nothing surprising about that. The aristocrat remembered that she had not seen Tess since that meeting in the library. Now he looked depressed, and she thought that he was ill. Suddenly their gazes met. The girl immediately looked away, but the crown prince's eyes sparkled with surprise and joy. As if unable to control himself, Tesvalun excitedly shouted his friend's name. His mother grabbed him by the shoulder, trying to stop him. The woman leaned over and gave the boy a stern look. She explained that he should have controlled himself. The mother cast a calm glance around the room and reminded them that people were watching them. Little Lady Harland immediately felt uneasy. However, Tess did not understand the complaint and loudly declared that he wanted to go to Eusennial. The nobles again began to whisper, surprised by the prince's open love. Some concluded that the Harlands were simply eager to marry their daughter off to the imperial family. Eusennial gritted her teeth. One of the guests complained that the Harland family was too selfish. He could not understand how they had managed to get close to the crown prince. The entire aristocracy of the empire had gathered in this place. Eusennial knew that the more rumors spread, the worse it would be for her family. Seeing her daughter's anxiety, Mother Seal advised her not to pay attention. However, the girl did not want to cause them any more trouble. The noblewoman addressed Theswalin with formal politeness, not missing a single title. He flinched, struck by her detachment. The girl bowed gracefully, trying to maintain her dignity. With slight embarrassment, she apologized for greeting him so late. Eusennial gritted her teeth as she congratulated the crown prince on his birthday. His face was one of obvious horror and bewilderment. Tess asked Lady Harland in a trembling voice not to address him so formally, but she knew perfectly well that he did not like it. With wet eyes, the crown prince asked why Eusennial was doing this. She had to draw a line between them. Guests chatted animatedly and sampled treats in small groups. Bright, warm light poured through the windows, filling the room with coziness. Some of the guests laughed loudly, and this even pleased Eusennial. She stood to the side, watching them, and breathed a sigh of quiet relief. The aristocrat was very pleased that the visitors finally turned their attention to the banquet. This happened thanks to the intervention of His Majesty. At the most heated moment, the man laughingly praised the kindness of the lady of the Harland family. The girl froze, surprised. The emperor suggested that the couple finish their little social conversation, as they were already long awaited. It was time to begin the reception. Eusennial could no longer meet Tess's gaze. His clear blue eyes, like the sky, were full of bitterness and betrayal. From now on, the crown prince must appear in public often. At such meetings, the children were to keep their distance from each other. Lady Harland admitted that she had not expected Nosbel to react so strongly. She was haunted by the feeling that she had abandoned him. Suddenly, Ethel approached the aristocrat, putting his hands on his hips. He kindly asked why she was standing quietly alone. Gesturing to the group behind him, Bonhart stated that everyone was simply eager to talk to Eusennial. She replied that she did not feel like talking right now. The boy firmly said that he could not leave the girl alone at such a moment. He asked her to admit that he was a wonderful friend to her. This involuntarily raised the aristocrat's spirits. With doubt in her voice, she asked why Ethel had cancelled their joint fencing lessons. The question took Bonhart by surprise, but he stated that he had received an invitation to train with the Imperial Knights. Ethel recalled his dream of becoming their commander. He noted that he could not miss such an opportunity, because such a chance came once in a lifetime. Scratching her chin, Eusennial decided to forgive her friend. These knights served the imperial family, and becoming one of them was not easy. Unable to contain her curiosity, the girl asked how he had received such an invitation. Bonhart explained that it was due to His Highness. Eusennial was genuinely surprised, her eyes widening in surprise. Her breath caught for a moment. The noblewoman asked if he was joking. The guy replied that Teswalin had personally asked Emperor Nosbel for a favor. With a smug smile, Ethel assured that His Majesty was amazed by his talent. The girl looked at him puzzled, remembering how Tess despised him. Eusennial interjected that she was greatly concerned about the crown prince's illness. She said that he had even taken foreign medicine. Hearing the lively conversation behind him, Teswalin Nosbel decided to turn around. His gaze lingered warily on those who were speaking. Noticing Tess's gaze, Eusennial began to show deep concern for his condition. A little confused, Ethel still managed to get into character. The crown prince watched in dismay. Suddenly, everyone froze as they heard a terrifying roar of thunder roll over the palace. Eusennial froze in fear and shock, as if she had lost touch with reality. Her subsequent memories of that day remained vague and hazy. Suddenly, a violent storm of thunder and lightning fell upon the palace. The windows shattered into pieces with a crash, and screams and panic arose among those gathered. Then Tess suddenly lost consciousness and his body collapsed on the hem of his mother's dress. The emperor loudly ordered the best physician to be brought immediately. The boy's parents leaned over him in horror, trying to help. Yuseniel watched them for a while, not knowing what to do next. The remaining nobles panicked and ran away, some shouting that demons were attacking. The Harlan family also hurried to leave. The father quickly picked up the girl in his arms and hurried to the exit. But she suddenly began to resist and resist. Ciel assured that the court physician was already there and Tess would recover. Mylene promised his daughter a quick meeting, and she, hugging him, calmed down. It turned out later that her father was wrong. The doors were slowly closing, but the girl noticed how worried doctors ran to Tess Valun. That day was the last time Yuseniel saw the familiar crown prince. Shortly after the incident, the emperor exiled her family to Valin. In 14 years, the boy has changed beyond recognition. His childhood friend has turned into a completely different person. The girl carefully took a small sip of green tea. Then she slammed the cup down on the table as if completing an important ritual. Ethel asked with interest what Yuseniel was thinking about. Sighing, she quietly admitted that her thoughts had been returning to the past. Yuseniel smiled and admitted that she had been thinking about the past and how fate had brought her here. She was now 20 years old.